Hola, ¿qué tal? Estamos en este programa de Pensadores Contemporáneos y hoy tenemos con nosotros a un invitado muy especial. Su nombre es Stanislas
Dehaene.
Siempre fallo con la pronunciación. Él es de Francia, es un neurocientífico que actualmente está en la mente de la ciencia, de los neurocientíficos del mundo, porque habla en sus libros, en sus artículos acerca de procesos cognitivos muy importantes que nos importan a todos, como la conciencia, como las matemáticas, como el lenguaje. Entonces vamos a platicar un poco con él acerca de estas cosas y más adelante quizás tengamos la oportunidad de platicar también sobre su relación con la enseñanza en Francia, a quien le piden opinión en el gobierno francés. Entonces es una figura muy importante, es un científico que actualmente tiene muchas publicaciones y que son de gran impacto. Entonces, bienvenido, Stanislas. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
It's a great pleasure for me.
Thanks. So, as a neuroscientist, as I am here in the Institute of Neuroscience in Mexico City, I'm really concerned about these topics of the brain, in particular these that you explain so well in your books, about consciousness, about language, about mathematics. And I have realized that sometimes you start your talks on your books with things about the earlier human beings, with these things that we maybe forgot already, but we used to do, like thinking in numbers, like tools, stuff like that. So how does that relate, the making tools perhaps, with the brain processes that goes to mathematics and so on?
For me, this is the one fascinating question. I call it the question of the singularity of the human brain and the human mind. First of all, it's fantastic that we are in an area where we begin to see bridges between the brain and the mind, and all the way up to consciousness. I think we really can make such bridges. But there is a really interesting question, which is why the human brain in particular is so special. We are the only species who have developed language, who have developed science as well. And by science, I mean the ability to understand the world in a much, much deeper way than other animals. So we're trying in the lab to understand what has changed. And I agree with you, it's a question of tools. We are the tool-using species, but we have to think of a very broad notion of tool. I see the system of writing, for instance, the alphabet, as a special tool, or the system of numbers as a tool. We begin to see how education to these tools is actually literally changing the brain. I have developed this idea of recycling, which is the view that whenever we acquire capacity in the human brain, such as the capacity for reading, we are in fact reorienting or repurposing circuits of the brain that were present for another purpose in our evolution, but were close enough to the final function that we could redirect them. So we redirect a system that is here to recognize objects and faces, and we repurpose it for the purpose of reading, for instance. So in this way, our species, the human species, has acquired a whole variety of new tools that expand our ability to understand the world.
So in this regard, the areas that are comprised in our brain to represent faces, you mean that we also use it for other things like, for example, writing, reading.
Reading especially. So what we have discovered with several colleagues is that there is a small area of the left hemisphere in the occipitotemporal sulcus which is involved in reading. And in people who don't read, or in illiterate people, this area does something else. It's dedicated to objects and face recognition. But when we learn to read, we specialize this region, and it essentially becomes responsive to strings of letters. And it's this area which allows us to be so quick. When we put our eyes on a written word, we immediately grasp its identity. Well, it's this region which is responsible for that. So when we learn to read, we specialize it for letters, but it means also that the functions of this area have to find space elsewhere. And what we have found is this very interesting competition between learning to read and recognition of faces, such that the face system in people who learn to read, the face system has to move more to the right hemisphere because of reading. Language is usually in the left hemisphere in most people, so faces have to move to the other hemisphere.
So these pattern recognition areas, right, like for faces,
Yes.
for instance, once you start using it by learning for reading, it's like there is no more room for adding more items, and then it has to go to the other hemisphere.
We don't fully understand whether it's really there is no more room, because we also know that these areas can differentiate. And the process of education and learning is a process whereby we start with a highly plastic system, which is diverse and will differentiate further in the course of learning. So one thing we see, for instance, which is quite remarkable as well, is that there will be a differentiation further between the symbols of letters and the symbols of numbers. And in patients, for instance, you may have a lesion that leaves the number system intact, but affects only the letter system. So this is an extreme case of specialization. And in general, we're discovering that there's a lot of specialization in the educated brain, and perhaps more than in the uneducated brain.
I see, I see. So this is because of the function it's taken. So
yes, well, these symbols play a very different function. We think it's also because of the connections. So letters connect to the language system, numbers connect to the quantity system in the parietal lobe in particular. Because this is a bilateral system, numbers go in both hemispheres, whereas language is much more left lateralized, so we see this visual word form area system, the reading system emerging in the left hemisphere especially.
So I've seen from your studies that the areas that represent numbers or mathematics that goes from to the dorsal pathway, you know, like the versus a ventral pathway that represents the objects themselves or the identity perhaps of the objects. The dorsal pathway in this side of the brain maybe is representing the position sometimes, and these particular areas I've seen is also related to the visual haptic things. So that goes back to my initial question, if maybe perhaps the reason why we make tools is that over there is something related to geometry.
Well, it's a very interesting set of questions, but I think in general we underestimate the level of abstractness of brain circuits. So yes, the dorsal pathway is one that cares a lot about space, certainly, and the positions of objects, but it's also a system that has been called the how system because it cares about how to shape the motor system to use objects, to grasp them, for instance. But I also think that there is more than that, and in fact I've called it the space, time and number system, because it's a system essentially for dealing with quantities. And it's not just, by the way, that space, time and number is my first name, Stan. But it's just a joke. But it's true. So this system deals with continuous quantities, including something as abstract as number. And this has been one of my early contributions, and really I really enjoy this work so much. This idea that we all are born with a number system, and in fact very old in evolution. So we have been able to show not only that humans have intuitions of number, like you look at this scene and you know how many objects there are, how many bottles, 4 bottles, you can estimate. But in fact this is a very old system, so it's already present in infants. Even infants, now this has been shown by a colleague, infants of a few hours of age. They are just born, they already have a system that tells them approximately how many objects are present in the world. So it's innate. And in fact, it's inherited from our evolution, so we can see that monkeys, but many other animal species have this system. And now in our new studies, we reconstitute this in the other direction, so we ask what happens in professional mathematicians. Well, what we find is that when they do professional mathematics, they still use the same circuit. The circuit has progressively differentiated with education, and now it becomes able to do a sort of generalized concept of number. In the history of mathematics, we apply the term number now to things like complex numbers or real numbers, which are extremely abstract objects. Well, it all started from this foundation in evolution and this process of neuronal recycling, constructing more and more abstract objects out of this foundational system of number and space and time.